Imagine a friend of yours has just been murdered, shot on his own doorstep as he left his house. Shot merely because he was a supporter of the democratically elected government. How would you react? How would you respond when your colleagues declare they're going to get revenge? Your enemies have been carrying out murders like this for months. It's time to strike back. In the middle of the night, you and your colleagues roam the streets looking for the opposition's leaders, the men you hold responsible for the wave of violence which has claimed the life of your friend. You find one. You kidnap him. They got one of yours, so you get one of theirs. Fair's fair, right? Even if you are all officers in the police. Hello and welcome to another episode of History's Most. This is History's Most Complicated War, Part 1, The Causes. My name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and today we are going to be looking at the build-up to the Spanish Civil War, which is, in our opinion, history's most complicated war, and we are going to be today looking at the years leading up to it and the causes. It's Part 3 of our 20th Century Spain series. We started way back in 1898, and this episode's going to cover the years 1931 to 36.
Yeah, and before we get into the Spanish Civil War for the episode, I think we should mention that you have just written a book that has just come out about the Spanish Civil War. We've mentioned it before, but I was thinking we mentioned it at the very beginning of the episode this time. Now that it's out,
put it front and center where it's deserves. No, yes, I've written a book. It's called "The People's Army in the Spanish Civil War." It's published by Pen and Sword, and it is a military history of the Spanish Civil War mainly from the perspective of the Republicans, which was the kind of left-wing faction in the Spanish Civil War, and it's looking at the war from their point of view and the point of view of their army, which was called the People's Army. So obviously, if you like the kind of stories we tell on the podcast, then it's along similar lines. It's tragedy and incompetence and bravery and all the kind of emotions that often episodes of History's Most have mixed in together.
Yeah, it really it captures the kind of atmosphere of the podcast. Now, you mentioned the Republicans there, and that's fitting because today we are going to be talking about the Spanish Republic.
Yes, the Spanish Second Republic, which we left off, didn't we? History's Most Benevolent Dictator, episode 2 of this series.
We did it on Primo de Rivera.
That's right, yeah, and we kind of, I think we were quite positive about him, weren't we?
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, we were pretty, for the most part. I mean, we did have to mention some of the things that he did that weren't very nice, but he, it was
fairly successful, wasn't it?
Fairly successful up until the end when he was very not successful.
Yeah, so we at the end of that podcast, we got to the point where Spain suddenly overnight became a republic because the monarchy, the king and the royal family fled the country because they realised that popular opinion had completely turned against them. And we've seen in the first 2 episodes of this series, particularly the worst democracy episode, I think, the amount of problems Spain had and the amount of internal division there was in Spain. So our kind of starting off point of April 1931 is quite remarkable in that there's a lot of kind of almost unity and optimism and excitement because the king flees the country, there's a bloodless revolution, a republic is declared, Spain's going to be a real proper democracy in the modern sense of the word for the first time. A government representing a broad range of opinion comes to office, and hopes are raised, probably unrealistically high, that so many problems we saw in Spain in the last few episodes, the backwardness of it, the economic issues, the corruption at a local level, are all going to be changed now that we've got, a republic. And I think one of the interesting things to note is this is, 1931. In the context of Europe, what's been happening over the years of the 20s and 30s has been the exact opposite of what's happening in Spain.
Yeah.
We've seen democracies fall, and indeed will do, over the next few years in the 20s and 30s in Europe. And Spain is embarking on its democratic experiment.
Yeah. It's kind of like a little bit out of step with history.
Yeah, it is. And of course the context as well of the Great Depression and the Age of Extremes around the West, then it's pretty interesting territory they're stepping into.
The optimism was really high at the time. And how soon did people kind of start to realize, okay, well, we've got a republic now, but are our problems really going to start going away overnight? Because I know that's what the general feeling was at the very beginning, after the republic had been immediately formed.
Yeah. The first kind of, I would say, real reality check, and almost the end to that sense of unity that there was across much of the nation in April 31 was actually in May, the following month, 1931. There was a series of violent attacks on churches, convents, religious buildings in that May. About 100 in total religious buildings were burnt down across Spain in riots over a few days in mid-May. Why did this happen? Well, in Spain, as we've kind of seen, the church had a very strong role in society and influence in political thought. And people on the left in Spain who felt that, the creation of a republic was a victory for them, really saw the church as having a negative influence on Spain and being responsible for kind of supporting the monarchy, supporting the establishment. And it was kind of almost expressing their anger by taking revenge on the people they saw as protecting the old order.
Right.
So there's a long tradition through the 19th and 20th century of anti-clericalism in Spain being this kind of bad habit of the left. And Manuel Azaña, who's one of the leading politicians of the Republic, declares that he would rather all the churches of Spain shall burn than the blood of a single Republican be shed. So you can see, the attitude of some of the people in the government, at least, was not particularly, bothered by this, not particularly concerned. On the other hand, the Minister of the Interior, Miguel Maura, who actually was the son of Antonio Maura, who featured heavily in our 2 episodes ago, did declare martial law and bring the army onto the streets in order to bring this to an end. So it's not as if there was no response, but what's more important is the way it's perceived, the way it's portrayed.
Yeah.
And for the Catholic Church and for kind of more conservative and right-wing Spaniards, already in the first month of its existence, the Republic is kind of delegitimized because, well, it's just letting the mob get away with it. It's and the words of someone like Azaña there are really inflammatory at this time of transition. People are going to think, well, clearly he's not on our side if you're a Catholic, if you're a conservative.
Yeah. I was going to ask what the normal conservative Spaniard's opinion
about the whole transition to republic would be. Was there any note of, monarchism or anything among some of the more conservative Spaniards?
Obviously, in the immediate aftermath, they're very much on the back foot.
Yeah.
The Spanish right, because of what's just happened. So it takes them a while to get their act together, which we'll see over the course of this episode. But there was people of the kind of centre-right, moderate conservatives, like actually Miguel Mara himself. The Prime Minister of the Republican government at this time is a guy called Alcalá Zamora, again of the same perspective. So the problem with this event is that it alienates a lot of that right-wing opinion.
Yeah.
Who might have gone along with the Republic and got involved in this new democratic system. But it gets off on a kind of bad note, if you like.
Yeah. So what happens next in the Republic's life? I mean, it's 1 month already, and we've already got some problems.
So what happens is they call for proper elections to be held. They're held in the June of 1931. It's an overwhelming victory for the parties who've created the Republic, which are the Socialist Party, which is the PSOE, PSOE, as well as several different Republican parties, so parties that support a republic. Some of them are kind of centre-left. Manuel Azaña, for example. Some of them are more centre-right, like the Prime Minister Alcalá Zamora's group. There's also a group called the Radicals, or the Radical Republicans, who are again more kind of on the centre to centre-right perspective. But basically, these groups who support the Republic overwhelmingly win this election, and Conservatives get very, very few seats because, like I said, they've not yet been able to organise the turno parties that have come up in the last two episodes cease to exist. So instantly, in 2 months, they haven't been able to build up a new political power base. So this Parliament Cortes assembles, and their job is to write a constitution.
Right.
Which is a tricky business.
No, I mean, they've tried, in our last episode, we discussed the writing of a constitution. That didn't work out very well.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, Primo tried and failed, didn't he? And it took him several years. The Republic spends quite a few months on it. And although they kind of have got a clear majority in the Cortes and can get whatever they want done, already some divisions start to come up. So the controversial parts of the Constitution are, it says that the Catholic Church is no longer the official religion of Spain, and actually cuts the ties between church and state and cuts subsidies to the church.
Right.
It bans the Jesuit order, which is obviously a Catholic organization. And it does various things around workers' rights, women's rights, like divorce, which obviously again is something that Catholics are not too keen on. It even says in the opening statement that the Spanish Republic, Spain is a republic of workers of all classes. So you can imagine how that sounds to people on the right.
Yeah.
So the Constitution doesn't go down well with people on the right, and in fact, some of the more prominent right-wing figures from the government actually resign when the Constitution is passed. So the Prime Minister, Alcalá Zamora, the Interior Minister, Miguel Mara, who I just mentioned, and the Radical Republican group basically leave the government once the Constitution is passed. Now, you have a system where you've got a Prime Minister who's the kind of head of the government running the day-to-day, and then the Parliament, the Cortes, selects a president. So Alcalá Zamora is then elected president by the Cortes, but like I say, it's more of a symbolic role. It's more basically taking the role that the king had before of selecting the prime minister, ensuring the smooth running of the system, rather than having executive power as president. So Manuel Azaña, who I just mentioned, was quite a divisive figure, and he'd also already managed to anger the army, because his position, by the way, before this was he was war minister, and he'd started trying to reduce the army's power, which made sense based on what we've learned so far from Spain. But he becomes the next prime minister, and you've got a fairly now narrow government. It's still got a majority, but it's a much narrower government of just the centre-left Republican groups and the Socialist Party. So within 6 to 8 months, the support for the Republic is already beginning to narrow.
So what was the army's reaction to all this? I mean, I would assume that they wouldn't be too happy about having the war minister, who was trying to downsize the army previously, as now head.
Yes, the army wasn't happy. Again, at first, like the right in general, they were pretty cowed because, of course, Primo's just fallen. Then you had General Boanguer for a little over a year, and he's fallen, and the monarch, who was technically the head of the armed forces, commander-in-chief, has run away. So the army at first is a little bit dislocated. They're not quite sure what to do. But yes, they are pretty quickly angered by the Republic, because Azaña, quite rightly tries to reduce the power of the army. We saw in the History's Worst Democracy, the army had way too much power. So he had tried to reduce the size of the Spanish officer corps, offered retirement on full pay. Ironically, the only people who really accepted this tended to be officers who supported the Republic, because this is a Republican scheme. So it ironically, almost accidentally purged the army of any pro-Republican officers. And army discontent's kind of bubbling up, and they get particularly annoyed because in 1932, the Republican government is trying to pass a law to grant autonomy to Catalonia, to grant it a kind of self-governing body called the Generalitat. Now, the Spanish army tends to be quite nationalistic, and tends to view itself as the guardian of Spain
as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. So this they would see as breaking up Spain, and something they were definitely not in favour of. So it's a trigger for an attempted coup that is launched in August of 1932, led by a guy called General Sanjurjo, who was known as the Lion of the Rif. He was a hero from the Moroccan War, from the kind of Africanista wing of the army, the kind of those who'd fought in Morocco, those who tended to be more militaristic, more nationalistic.
Yeah.
But the coup is pretty easily dismantled, it must be said. It doesn't attract the full support of the army. It doesn't attract much public support. Sanjurjo himself flees to Portugal. Key leaders of the coup are arrested. And it actually creates a second wave of enthusiasm for the Republic, and means that the Catalan autonomy bill that had been really struggling to get through the Cortes is kind of passed in the aftermath of this defeat of the coup. So the army for now is not happy, but they can't do much about it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask, because I mean, we know that from the previous episodes that the army was already kind of divided among the Africanistas and the what was the other faction?
Peninsula officers.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, what kind of sentiments did they carry into this new era for Spain? I mean,
it's interesting, because obviously the main kind of identifier for them, the Moroccan War, was concluded by Primo, wasn't it? Mm-hmm. That was the kind of, for the Africanistas, that was the be-all and end-all. One of the things that historians have kind of pointed out to, Balfour being a good example, is the idea that they have taken Spanish colonialism, taken the lessons of Morocco, and begin to apply it inwards, apply it to Spain.
Right.
And begin to, instead of looking at Morocco, which they've now kind of won the war there, look at the problems inside Spain. And what they see is a rising tide of liberalism, Marxism. They associate it all with Freemasonry. Some of the officers buy into the general conspiracy that's prevalent throughout kind of the right in Europe at this time, that it's kind of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy. So there's a Spanish kind of flavor of that. And that the Republic represents this kind of Marxist, Jewish, Freemason, liberal conspiracy to undermine Spain, undermine Spanish values. We've seen the attacks on the church. We've seen the attacks on the unity of Spain. We've seen attacks on the army. We'll probably talk in a bit as well, attacks on land ownership, which obviously a lot of army officers tend to be landowners too.
Yeah.
So they kind of start applying the lessons of Morocco to Spain itself, to their homeland. And there's a great kind of phrase from one of these generals who, there's a minor peasant uprising in rural southern Spain, I think in 1932 or 1933, and the general who's sent to put it down is an Africanista, and he declares, in a corner of Badajoz, Moroccan tribesmen or Rif tribesmen have made a base. He's describing Spanish peasantry as being like Moroccans. Because of the fact they are rebelling, because they are believing these ideas. So they're kind of
That's interesting. I mean, to compare your own countrymen to the people that you've just been fighting for so long, that's a weird one.
So there's this problem we're going to store up for the future. There's a clear cause of the war that's going to come. Is the army is just not happy.
Yeah. So to go back to the narrative, what happens after this coup that fails?
Well, it's probably that's the kind of high point for Afanya's government.
Right.
He manages to get that done because they begin to run out of steam for a few reasons. They're trying to do a lot of things, this Republican government. Obviously, the Constitution has changed a lot already, and they are trying to, tackle the power of the Catholic Church, tackle the power of the army. They're trying to build an actual democracy for the first time in modern Spain, amidst the context, obviously, of rising authoritarianism.
Yeah, the economy as well. Trying to fix the economy and wealth inequality. And remember, this is during the 1930s. This is during the Great Depression, which can't be easy.
No, I mean, it's such an ambitious project to undertake at this exact moment.
Yeah.
So they are trying to tackle, like you say, inequality. They one of the ways they do that is they really focus on education. They build 10,000 schools. As well, alongside that, they have this kind of quite kind of liberal cultural mission where these they set up visits of, plays, authors, poets who go around rural Spain to villages and try and bring culture to uneducated people. They set up 3,000 village libraries. Like I mentioned, women have actual rights for the first time. They've given autonomy to Catalonia. There's planning to give it to other regions as well, like the Basques and like Galicia. So they're trying to do a lot, but it's really difficult, and expectations are so high because this is the first time, for example, the socialists are in power, So their supporters think, oh, amazing, we're going to just change society, we're going to be equal and everything. But of course, it's not as easy as that. One of the reasons it's not as easy as that is because they don't get widespread, they don't have the support of the whole population behind them. And not just from the right, as we've mentioned, but also from the far left.
Now that's an interesting one, because we've been talking about the right a lot, and it's important to remember that there are still some elements. We'd mentioned the anarchists in I think the last episode a little bit, and they're going to play a pretty important role in this.
Yes, so more levels of complexity is that the left isn't actually fully behind the Republic, because a strong force on the Spanish left, over a million members, is the anarchist movement, or the anarcho-syndicalist movement.
Yeah.
Yes, they came up a lot in the last couple of episodes, thinking about like the social war during the turno era. And the anarchists see the Republic as just as evil as any monarchy. And in fact, for some of them, the Republic's worse than the monarchy had been, because some of the workers support the Republic.
Yeah, they think that, but when they had monarchy, you were pretty much united against this one force. But now the more moderate elements start turning to the Republic and saying, well, this isn't so bad. And they don't want that. They're anarchists, so
they want to get rid of the state. So an extremist faction within the anarchist movement had actually been founded during the Primo years, because the anarchist movement had been forced underground, called the FI. So you had the CNT, which was the kind of mainstream anarchist movement. So often people talk about the CNT FI as hyphenated, just to describe the entire kind of anarchist movement.
Yeah.
And their policy was known as revolutionary gymnastics. They knew they weren't strong enough to stage an uprising to overthrow the Republic, at least yet. So they carried out revolutionary strikes or mini uprisings or riots or protests to try and... Gymnastics is almost like practicing, isn't it? And getting the people prepared for the greater struggle that was to come.
Yeah.
One of the worst examples of this occurred in January of 1933. A little village in rural southern Spain called Casas Viejas. It was a pretty local, small-scale affair, but a group of anarchist peasants staged an uprising. They shot a police officer, and then the Republican police turned up, and basically the anarchists were all holed up in one house trying to fire out, and so the police set fire to it. Anyone running out they shot, and they killed 19 peasants. And of course, this is a big story, and it is built, totally leapt upon by the press of both the left and the right, actually. For the right, it's like, oh, look at the murderous Republic. They are hypocritical here, but they're saying, look at the Republic murdering its own people. For the left, you think about socialist opinion, and even though they're not supporters of the anarchists, it's a bad look for a socialist party who's part of a government that is killing the poor, the poorest. So the Casas Viejas incident really helps to bring Azaña down, because his coalition of centre-left Republicans and the Socialist Party is beginning to crack. There's local elections in April of 1933, and right-wing groups take a clear kind of win. There's a law passed in the May of 1933 called the Law of Congregations, which says that religious schools are going to lose all their funding. The president, Alcalá Zamora, who is a Catholic, as we said before, he's kind of moderate right, thinks, actually, maybe I want to get rid of this guy as prime minister. So Azaña's losing both support from his left-wing allies and from the kind of right. And so eventually a vote of no confidence is tabled in his government. And although he wins it very narrowly, 2/3 of the Cortes actually abstained on the vote. So although it wasn't actually technically constitutional because he hadn't lost the vote of no confidence, President Alcalá Zamora asks for Azaña's resignation because he thinks he no longer commands, enough support.
Yeah. Does he resign?
He does, and Alcalá Zamora appoints the head of the radical party I mentioned before, the centre-right Republican group. A guy called Alejandro Lerroux is appointed as the new prime minister. He swiftly loses a vote of no confidence because the right, as we already mentioned, doesn't have that much representation in the Cortes as it stood at that point, and therefore the president calls for an election.
Okay. Now, what's happening now? Because it's moving so quickly here. I mean, we've just had elections, and I mean everything seems like it's kind of falling apart a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Azaña's government had, like we said, we talked about all the things it was trying to do, but it had really hit the buffers by 1933. His own coalition was falling apart. Public opinion was turning against him. That didn't have the support of the president, and so we go to another elections in November of 33. So, only 2 years on from the foundation of the republic, and really, yeah, like you said, we've got opposition from left, we've got opposition from the right, we've got uprisings from left and right, we've got high unemployment. It was about 13%. We've got certain groups like the army, like Catholics, who have really decided by now that the Republic is, not just Azaña's government, but that the Republic itself is the enemy. Because after all, the Constitution had enshrined a lot of things that they were opposed to fundamentally. So they never accepted the existence of the Republic and the existence of the democratic system, which obviously was going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And another group they'd really annoyed Azaña's government was landowners. And they'd passed a bill in 1932 called the Agrarian Reform Act, which was supposed to do exactly that, reform the rural areas, redistribute land. The hope was that about 60 to 70,000 peasant families per year could be given their own land, to begin to deal with the massive kind of rural poverty and inequality. But you can imagine that the big landowners...
they're not going to be happy about this.
No. So you've entrenched another opponent there.
Yeah, I mean, they're really starting to get enemies on all sides here, and they're just becoming more radicalized.
Powerful enemies,
Yeah.
And like you said, radicalized ones who are not going to just be like, oh well, who are totally just going to oppose all reform and try and undo the system. I mean, for example, the Reform Act, the Agrarian Reform Act, had only managed to settle about 6,000 to 7,000 families when the aim was 60,000 to 70,000 a year.
Yeah.
Because of landowner intransigence, and they would just put up they would obviously challenge the legal challenges to slow this down. And of course, you've then got the fact that the socialists, the PSOE, are beginning to lose faith with Azaña and their left Republican allies. So very, very quickly, you've got a situation where it's all falling apart, the Republican project. And it's really tricky to say, and historians are very divided to say, I must admit, of whose fault this is. Is it Azaña and the Republicans being way too ambitious and taking on every vested interest and every power in Spain at once? And of course they're going to fail. Or from the other point of view, and the socialists, for example, would think this: are they not being ambitious enough? Should they have crushed their enemies and totally stripped them of any kind of wealth and power that they might have had, in order to actually get radical change done?
It's a tricky question, and I mean it's it's a heavier decision than we can make right now, but it is tough to think about, because it inherently has problems from both sides. I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. I think that they are overambitious from the beginning, especially within the context of, they've just come out of a dictatorship, and they're in the Great Depression. They don't have enough money even to do this, really. But at the same time, it's noble, what they're trying to do.
I think from a modern perspective, with hindsight,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in the modern West would look at those aims of what they're trying to do and think, reduce the power of the church, stop the army interfering in politics,
Yeah.
women's rights, whatever, tackling extreme poverty, it's got to be done. But at the time, trying to fight all those vested interests was extremely difficult, and there was a lot of intransigence from people who just, nobody likes to give up a power and privileged position they might have, would they?
Yeah. You mentioned, from a modern perspective, this is, for 1931, this is a pretty modern kind of republic. It has very modern ideals.
Yeah, I think they were hoping. I think for a lot of Republicans, their ideal vision was like, say, France.
Yeah.
The kind of values of the French Republic, of liberty, egalitarianism, equality. And they really were looking to Western Europe as the kind of model. But obviously, that's quite contested, because a lot of Europe at this time, like we've mentioned, is switching to authoritarianism. So they're experimenting with democracy at a time when everyone else seems to be going the other way.
Yeah. Italy obviously has been fascist for a while now, and Germany, with the Weimar Republic, slowly becoming more radicalized at this point in time. The Nazis are gaining some power. Like I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit out of step with history. But what happens next?
So you get this election in November of 1933, and it's a victory for the right. Larox's centre-right radical group forms a government, but actually the party that wins the most votes and the most seats in the Cortes is a new party. Like I said, the right hadn't really got their act together at first when the Republic was created, because, of course, their old parties and institutions had disappeared. But various right-wing groups had been established in the intervening time between 1931 and 1933. And in early 1933, a newly founded kind of alliance of different right-wing groups was created called CEDA, C-E-D-A. And this was kind of a right-wing conservative Catholic party led by a kind of young, up-and-coming figure of the Spanish right called Jose Maria Gil Robles. And he was, you might think he his party got the most seats in the Cortes. How come he wasn't asked to form a government and become prime minister? Well, Alcala Zamora, the president, although he was right-wing, he was a Republican. He did support democracy. And he was suspicious of Gil Robles, and he basically wasn't sure that Gil Robles was committed to democracy and to the Republic. For the main reason that Gil Robles, whenever asked, refused to commit himself to the Constitution and the Republic. And, the CEDA did have kind of fascist overtones in some of its kind of propaganda. They kind of did rallies with torches and things like that. They had a youth movement with uniforms and all sorts of things like this. So some people, some historians are kind of generous to Gil Robles and say, well, those are kind of just the style of right-wing politics at the time, and he was actually bravely trying to bring the right into the democratic fold. Whereas, of course, you imagine, on the other hand, historians writing, some of them, say Paul Preston, very much takes the line that no, Theda was
inherently, fascist,
certainly had
yeah,
so authoritarian kind of ambitions, and wanted to basically win elections in order to basically transform the Republic beyond all recognition and turn it into some sort of right-wing state.
Yeah.
So the Radical Party is the government, but they're a minority government, and they have to rely on the Theda to pass any law, any vote through the Cortes. So obviously that puts Gil Robles and Theda in quite a strong position. They can kind of ask for, whatever they want. And the left is very much weakened by this election, mainly because they had previously run as an alliance, like a joint ticket. But now, because they'd fallen out in coalition, the socialists and the left Republican groups ran separately, and as a result, they really suffered, due to the electoral system. So, for example, PSOE got 1.6 million votes and 59 seats. On the other hand, the Radicals got half as many votes and nearly twice as many seats. Because they were running a kind of right-wing joint ticket with Theda.
Right.
Or they, deliberately entered into local tactical alliances, like we won't run here if you don't run there, that sort of thing. So kind of maximized their vote. And the next kind of couple of years are known as the second or the Black Biennium 2 years, because things kind of take a dark turn in the Republic. Again, there's some debate here, but some historians, certainly, again, Paul Preston, would see it as the aim of the Radicals, once they're in power, very much egged on by Theda, is to just turn back the clock, undo all the reforms that have just been done. So while the Radicals, as I say, are Republicans in the sense they do support democracy, they continue with, say, the school building program. But on the other hand, they undo certain things, like they undo the law of congregations to close Catholic schools. They get rid of socialists from the mixed juries. This was something that Primo had first introduced. Do you remember the kind of arbitration, cooperation between employers and employees? They lift a ban that had been in place on hiring, on landowners hiring non-locals to work on their land, because often in disputes between landowners and the peasants, the landowner would just go and get some labour from elsewhere in order to kind of lock out the peasants and starve them out.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So they kind of are turning back the clock on some of the reforms the Republic had done, or Thanya's government had done, and there's a turn back the clock in terms of the attitudes. So landowners and bosses feel empowered to kind of just undo the gains that they've been forced to concede, whether with a legal basis or not. Extend the working day, cut wages, that sort of thing.
Kind of going back to that caciqueism that we had, in the early days.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it doesn't help with that, by the way, that the Radicals are really a very, very corrupt political party in the style of the old Turno parties. Yeah. That'll come up in the not-too-distant future. But there was a phrase that apparently used to be used by landowners to peasants who might be complaining about their pitifully low wages, which was, you can eat the Republic. So this idea that, well, you've got your democracy, there you go.
Mm.
That stop complaining. But of course, democracy and freedoms and things, all these expectations that have been raised, they don't put food in your belly and they don't put kind of money in your pocket.
Yeah. I would assume at this point in time, especially among peasants, the kind of attitude, that optimism that they had at the beginning is very, very quickly kind of becoming jaded and fading away.
Absolutely. On the other hand, of course, the right is very kind of happy about this.
Yeah.
And Gil Robles is in a position of kind of real power. According to, like I say, there's a divide between historians of whether this, Gil Robles is a kind of, brave figure trying to, represent the right in the Republic and balance things out and bring an end to conflict by bringing the right into democratic normality. On the other hand, Romero argues that, well, I'll give you the quote. Robles' objective was to foster political instability, split the radicals, and leave Larroix, that's the radical leader, more dependent on right-wing votes until finally Theda could, on its own, destroy the Republican Constitution and create an authoritarian corporate state.
Mm. So
yeah.
So I mean, this is the fact that we have a bunch of different historians kind of arguing about this kind of just tells us how complicated and how unusual this period was for Spain, because it's something that we can look back at now, and there's really no solid answers about anything about this whole period in Spain. Yeah. And I mean,
for example,
it is recent history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's always going to be, difficult to come to conclusions when it comes to recent history, but it's particularly hard when it comes to talking about the Second Spanish Republic and the Spanish Civil War.
Because no one's blameless entirely. Like we're just trying to sum up Athania's government there. I mean, on the other hand, someone like Stanley Payne, who's a American historian, a bit more conservative in his views, would say that actually the radicals were the only true kind of democratic party who represented all Spaniards. He actually uses that in a phrase, that phrase, or nearly identical phrase, in his book, Spain, A Unique History. So, like I say, historians are really divided on this. And so although you might say this period of radicals and Theda government is, turning back the clock and is regressive and is the road to fascism, on the other hand, you have historians saying this is the only true attempt at doing democracy properly. And, Payne says that Athania and his Republicans, his left Republicans, were not only incompetent but also willing to kind of just attack anyone and break the rules to get their own way. Anyway, there is quite a bit of evidence that Robles was trying to destabilize the Republic. Because the radical Larroix government relied on him and his votes, he could just at will say he didn't like that law or he didn't like that minister, that member of the cabinet, and say, well, drop it or else we will withdraw our support for you. And so because of that, there was 11 governmental crises over the next 2 years of having to be a change of cabinet or resignation or that sort of thing. To give you just one example, only a few months into this government, in March 1934, Theda said, right, we are going to withdraw support from your government unless Diego Martinez Barrio, who was the interior minister, gets sacked because he's too soft. He's interior minister's in charge of security, and he was one of the more centrist members of the Radical Party. So they basically demanded his head, and Larroix obeyed, chose a hardline southern landowner to be the new interior minister. The following month, April 34, Theda demanded an amnesty for anyone involved in the 1932 coup, the army coup.
Yeah.
Again, the government's forced to go along with it. And because of this, Martinez Barrio himself, who's been sacked in May, so this is quite 3 months, basically walks out of the Radical Party, takes 22 of the Radicals' deputies, their MPs, with them, and moves over to the left Republican side. So the Radical government is even weaker. It's been deprived of its most kind of liberal centrist members, and they've just lost about a fifth of their membership. So they're even more reliant on the support of Theda.
And I would imagine that radicalizes them a little bit more as well, because the more moderate elements have just left.
Oh, exactly right. So, as you can imagine, we are kind of on the road here to some sort of conflict happening.
Yeah.
So the socialists and the left in general are pretty unhappy because all the kind of wins and benefits that they see as having come in the last few years are being undone. So there's a agricultural strike over the summer, and the interior minister, this hardliner that they've brought in on Theda's request, called Salazar Alonso, basically responds with violence, crushes the strike. 13 people killed, hundreds of people arrested, lots of local councils that the PSOE, the Socialist Party, might control, they were basically replaced. You had even 4 socialist deputies, members of the Cortes, were arrested. So you've got a beginning of, again, the kind of repression that we were seeing in the kind of Turno years, in the Primo years. And it all comes to a head when the regional government in Catalonia tries to carry out some of its own agricultural reform, says if you've cultivated a piece of land for 18 years, you should have the right to buy it off the landowner. And Theda, again, standing up for the interests of the right, like private property, for example, says, well, that's ridiculous. It's your land, you should be able to decide whether you sell it or not. Doesn't matter if the peasants lived there for 18 years. And says that this time, this is September 34, we are going to withdraw our support from your government, the radicals, unless you give us some seats in the cabinet.
How well does this go down?
Well, this is pretty serious because, like I said, Theda is regarded as, particularly by the left in Spain, as like Spanish variant of fascism.
Yeah.
Gil Robles is hailed at Theda rallies as the jefe, the chief, a bit like, kind of, we see Hitler as the Führer or Mussolini as the Duce. And the language that they used in their kind of rallies was seen as reminiscent of fascism in its style, at the very least, if not its rhetoric as well. I mean, Gil Robles has actually gone to the Nuremberg Rallies. Guest. And you've got to think as well of the context. Hitler's taken over Germany in 1933. In Austria in 1934, in the February, so about 7 months before this, a right-wing Catholic party had also kind of done a kind of takeover and destroyed the left and seized total power. And the language that Theda was using, I'll give you some examples. Kind of language they used. They said things like, Spain has to be defended against Jews, heretics, Freemasons, liberals, and Marxists. Gil Robles himself had said, power will soon be ours. No one can stop us imposing our ideas. He'd also said that I prefer a nation of lunatics to a nation of wretches. I think kind of...
I can take a guess as to who his idea of the wretches are.
Yeah.
Very fascist in language.
So even those historians who might defend Theda and say, look, this is all just rhetoric, this is just the style of right-wing politics at the time, you can at least concede, surely, that the left would be a bit concerned by that kind of language. So at the start of October, the government resigns, and Alcalá Zamora and Larroix, the kind of two figures of the moderate right, are kind of weighing up whether to let Theda into the government. To try and influence their decision, the socialists say, well, if Theda enters the government, we will call a general strike. We'll stage a kind of almost revolutionary strike. Now, all the evidence points to the fact that this was a threat intended to intimidate the moderate right, the radicals, and stop them from giving in to Gil Robles. The main fact being the socialists hadn't really prepared for this at all. They hadn't put much plans in place. But on the 4th of October, nevertheless, a new government is created. The radicals still at the head, but 3 members of Theda are ministers in the cabinet. So the following day, a general strike is held. But it's a total fiasco. Like I said, it wasn't planned very well.
Yeah.
The socialists, it's really half-hearted, and the government is very determined to put it down. In Catalonia, the local government tries to declare some sort of form of Catalan independence, but it only lasts a few hours. The Generalitat, the Catalan autonomous government, is shut down. The only region where this uprising, this revolution, this strike has any real success or is in any way kind of serious threat is Asturias, which is a kind of mostly mining region in northern Spain, where workers seize control of most of the region. They battle with the police, the army. They take control of Oviedo, the major city there. They mostly use like dynamite because they're miners, so they have access to explosives. But they basically fight off the army and police forces for about 2 weeks until it's finally crushed. But as you can imagine, the right comes down hard. The repression, at least 1,300 people are killed. Around 30 to 40,000 people are arrested, including some of the leading figures of the left. Others have to basically flee the country. Local councils, any of them that still have socialist or left Republican people in charge, are just dismissed and replaced. And so you go into 1935 with Theda really being kind of in the driving seat and the left totally in retreat.
Now, we're only about a year away from the Spanish Civil War actually breaking out, which is, caused by, political kind of division. But it sounds like everything is kind of going in the direction that the right wing wants. So what happens?
Well, yeah, you'd have thought it's funny that the Spanish Civil War starts in 1936 as a right-wing uprising against a left-wing government, and yet going into 1935, the right seem in an unassailable position, right?
Yeah.
There's a series of events that kind of make this happen, which is almost kind of chance. That's going to come evident later. So I guess this it's often called the Asturias Rising, shows that we're clearly on the path to a major civil conflict, doesn't it? To actually put it down, to crush it, they had to actually transport the elite Africanista troops from Morocco to northern Spain.
Wow.
All overseen by one of the leading Africanistas, Francisco Franco, who,
powerful, a name that we're definitely going to come to here in a bit.
Yeah. But Asturias is, I think, so important in explaining how we get to a civil war, because it means both sides see each other as existential threats.
Yeah.
There's no ground for compromise, because the left looks at Asturias and sees, well, the right are determined to turn back the clock. They're determined to undo everything positive we do. And look, they're arresting thousands of us. They're shutting down our newspapers, our organizations, our unions. is this the start of a fascist takeover? Or at least some sort of authoritarian regime, right? And you can kind of see that it has some of those hallmarks. On the other hand, the right looks at Asturias and says, well, look, the left is clearly in a revolutionary mood. We know what happened in Russia. Could we be seeing a Bolshevik uprising in Spain sometime soon? We've seen that the left is prepared to resort to violence, you know. And so both sides seem to have, to some extent, disregarded democracy. And both sides crucially see each other as a mortal threat.
Yeah.
So not just an enemy that, you know,
can be defeated
in fight at the ballot box. Yeah. But as someone who is a threat to our very existence.
So how do we get to a position where, you know, the left is in power here?
Yeah. So it seems like the right, you know, has now got everything they want. Theda actually, in April of 35, demands more seats in the cabinet, and they get 5 this time. Gil Robles himself becomes war minister, which is obviously a really important position because he got control of the army. One of the people Gil Robles brings in, he makes chief of the general staff of the Spanish army, Francisco Franco. He promotes other key Africanistas. So, yeah, the right seems to be in a position of real power. The radical Theda coalition government is kind of unassailable, surely. Well, no. In the autumn of 35, the Radical Party, I mentioned, I kind of forewarned, it was quite a corrupt institution. And it gets brought down by a series of financial scandals in the autumn of 1935. The first
unexpected
one is the funniest for me. This is proper history's most stuff. This was called the Strapalero scandal in October of 1935. And it transpired that the radicals had accepted money from basically con men to allow in casinos in Spain for basically rigged roulette wheels to be installed.
Okay.
I know, is that ridiculous? So they basically, I think it was a Dutch con man came to them and said, look, I'll give you this much money if you let me in casinos. I think there was like a button under the table they could press or something to make sure that the people gambling at these casinos lost their money.
Wow.
I know. I mean, that it's just insane that is actually something that a government would be involved in.
You're right. That is proper history's most material.
So, if it wasn't bad enough for Alejandro Lerroux, the following month there was a massive scandal over misappropriation of public funds. Yeah, basically taxpayers' money going missing, radical ministers having a lot to do with it. And so the Radical Party just disintegrates. Lerroux is totally discredited, as you can imagine. And of course, Gil Robles thinks, perfect, you know, he's been working, if you believe a historian like Romero, he's been working for the last 2 years to destroy the Radical Party so that Theda can just inherit the state, if you like. And he thinks his time has come. And he assumes that the president, Alcala Zamora, is going to appoint him as prime minister because, you know, what alternative is there?
Yeah.
And then he doesn't.
Who does he appoint?
Well, Alcala Zamora says to Gil Robles, I don't trust you. I don't think you're going to respect the Constitution. I don't think you're going to respect the Republic. So I am going to dissolve the Cortes and call for a new election.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And just like how when he got rid of Athania, it was, you know, borderline unconstitutional. This also is pretty unconstitutional. He just doesn't appoint him prime minister because he doesn't like him and he doesn't think he's trustworthy.
It's weird. It's unconstitutional, but it also is protecting the Constitution in a way, like the Constitution as a concept. Like it weird.
Yeah, it is very strange. And it is this layer of complexity as well to this. That Alcala Zamora, who had, was right wing, he was a conservative, but he didn't really like Theda. So you have elections called, and they're going to take place in February of 1936. And as you can imagine, it's a really polarized election.
Yeah,
it's really hostile. I think I've seen it described as like a win or die atmosphere.
right.
Because the left, after what I said after Asturias, the left thinks if the right wing, this is it, we're going down the dictatorship road. The right thinks, well, if the left wing win, then we're just going to see Bolshevism in Spain.
Yeah.
So the left had really struggled in 1933 because, as I said, their alliance broke down, so they ran separately and lost votes or lost seats because of it. On the other hand, Manuel Azaña had worked really hard to rebuild the alliance between his Republicans and the Socialists, and he managed to do it. They created an alliance called the Popular Front, but on the insistence of the Socialists, particularly the left-wing branch, the left-wing faction within the Socialist Party, led by a guy called an old trade unionist called Largo Caballero, they insisted on broadening the alliance. So they included smaller groups of the left as well, like the Spanish Communist Party. So it was a broad left-wing alliance of everyone kind of from liberals like Azaña through to communists. And it also had the tacit support of the anarchists, actually, who normally, they didn't run in elections and they didn't run in this one, and normally told their supporters not to vote. But one of the few kind of solid policies of the Popular Front was an amnesty for political prisoners. People who've been locked up after the Asturias uprising are going to be released. And of course, the anarchist movement was definitely all for that. On the other hand, of course, you had Gil Robles, Theda, an alliance of the right known as the National Bloc, whose campaign was focused on law and order, understandably, Christian values, that sort of thing. And in February of 1936, it's close in terms of total votes cast for each of these big alliances, but the Popular Front wins.
So we've just gone from near dictatorship to electing a front which has the Communist Party in it.
Yeah.
It's amazing how quickly that's gone.
It's changed, overnight.
And it's going to change again very, very quickly.
Well, on the actual night of the election, as the results were coming in, Gil Robles and General Franco, who, as I said, Gil Robles had made chief of the general staff, try and persuade the caretaker prime minister to stay on, to annul the election results and to declare martial law. But he didn't do it. So the right didn't take defeat very well. They instantly thought about what can we do about this. Now that plan fails, and the seeming plan of Gil Robles to win at the ballot box and dismantle the Republic from the inside had failed as well. So straight away he puts Theda's party funds at the disposal of a group of army officers.
Right.
And slowly over the course of the spring, a group of army officers, many of them Africanistas, nationalistic army officers, begin plotting and begin thinking about a military coup. And it takes definite shape from about March 1936 onwards. A guy called Emilio Mola is the self-appointed director of the coup, and he begins approaching different officers, approaching also different political groups, and kind of working on a plan for some sort of uprising or coup. You also get some extreme right-wing groups. First of all, those extreme right-wing groups suddenly explode in popularity over the spring of 1936 because Theda has lost. The legalist approach seems to have lost. And so you have a fascist party called the Falange, which is led by Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, son of Miguel, the dictator from last episode. Their membership and popularity suddenly explodes. There's a bit of unclarity here, but certainly a very large number of the Theda youth movement that I said was like uniformed fascist kind of youth movement just switches over to the Falange. You also have a movement called the Carlists, who were well, Stanley Payne has said that the kind of extreme Catholicism they advocated is the closest we've seen in the West to like fundamentalist Islam.
Yeah.
Interesting perspective.
It really, I mean, I've read up a little bit about the Carlists, and you've told me stories about the Carlists, and how they would. We've seen pictures of, I mean, sermons taking place with priests on top of tanks.
Yeah, I mean,
it's like something out of Warhammer.
This is a good point. They were, I guess, extreme Catholics who preached that the Republic was the embodiment of the Antichrist, and that basically they advocated a return to a traditional society. They wanted to basically turn back the clock to when Spain was you think about 16th century Spain, with the Inquisition and things like that, was like a Catholic theocracy kind of thing, where religion was the overriding dominant force of public life, and they basically were against modernity. So you've got these radical right-wing movements growing, and obviously they're pretty unhappy, and the Falange in particular is violent. They carry out basically provocative violence against left-wingers. They assassinate prominent figures on the left, trade union leaders, that sort of thing. And there's also provocative speeches from the likes of Gil Robles, who say, like, oh, Spain's fallen into anarchy. It's time for the army to act, whatever that might mean. So on the right, very clearly, they're not just going to accept defeat and wait 4 years till there's another election or whatever. On the left, unfortunately, there's also a lot of problems and division, because although the Popular Front won the election, and like I said, it was a very broad alliance, only the Athania's left Republican groups actually take office. The Socialist Party refuses to take office. Now, the reason they do this is very short-sighted. The key figure in the Socialist Party, I've just mentioned Largo Caballero, thinks that the time is very much coming close for socialist takeover. And he kind of views Athania and his basically weak minority government of left Republicans as like the Kerensky regime in the Russian Revolution.
Right.
Kind of moderate government that is not going to last very long, after which the left is going to have the chance to take over properly. And so Caballero is playing this dangerous game of waiting for something to happen in order that the socialists can just take power themselves and not have to worry about governing with these liberal Republicans, because of course last time they tried that they got a bit frustrated with the failure to bring about real change. Now, in the country more widely, there's a huge amount of unrest and violence. There's strikes, there's peasants just seizing land, there's violence between left and right, as we kind of mentioned just there with the Falange. Because just as when the right won the election last time round, it was not just about laws, it was about attitudes. Bosses, employers, landowners felt empowered. So now peasants and workers feel empowered because we've won.
Yeah.
So we're going to ask for higher wages, or we're going to take the land that we have been promised, whether or not it's legal, And the Athania's government on its own, it's a minority government. It hasn't got the support of the other Popular Front parties in the Cortes, so it's really struggling to actually have an impact. It seems like things are running out of control. So Athania comes up with a plan. His plan is to impeach President Alcala Zamora.
Okay. How's he going to do that?
Well, Alcala Zamora had twice dissolved the Cortes, which was unconstitutional, because he'd done it in 33 to get rid of Athania, and he'd done it in 35 to get rid of Gil Robles. And so he was successfully impeached. He'd violated the Constitution.
Oh.
So Athania ascended in May 1936 to be president. Now, as we've kind of said, the president had the oversight, but he didn't have executive power. He wasn't running the government.
Yeah.
And as we've seen, Alcala Zamora has kind of been a periphery figure, mostly in this story. So Athania's big plan was he was going to bring in as prime minister one of his closest allies, a guy called Endeletheo Prieto. Now, Prieto was a moderate socialist in the PSOE party. And he was seen as like one of the leading kind of talents on the left. He was hardworking, he was capable. And they basically thought that together, Athania as president, Prieto as prime minister, together they'd get a handle on the situation. And it would be like a strong, dynamic partnership. But our old friend Largo Caballero incidentally hates Prieto because he's his main rival for the leadership of the Socialist Party. And he just says no. He bars him from taking office.
Right.
So instead, Athania has to scratch around for an ally to make his prime minister. And he chooses Santiago Careces Quiroga, who is basically one of Athania's cronies, one of his long-term allies, but he is weak. He's dying of tuberculosis. And instead of getting a dynamic duo to try and tackle this rapidly escalating situation, you get a weak prime minister, and Athania as president is kind of detached. So, not only can they not deal with all the problems overflowing Spain, but they also really fail to deal with rumours of a military coup. In fact, their initiative is to send the suspected generals to faraway postings. But it just means they can't keep an eye on them.
Yeah.
And some of the moves are ridiculous. They send Mola, who's the self-appointed director of the coup, they send him to Navarre, which is the region where the Carlists are most popular.
That's...
So he begins building up a relationship with the Carlist movement.
That's a bit short-sighted.
Yeah.
I mean... Huh. Yeah, I mean, I heard that they also sent some generals to, like the islands,
Franco's sent to the Canary Islands. Yeah. And again, it just means you can't keep an eye on him.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, what happens? I mean, because this is all building up to something. It's all coming up.
Yeah. We're there pretty much. So by the summer, obviously, we've got an intolerable situation. Certainly, there's a law and order problem from both left and right-wing extremists. The government is weak. The socialists are content, or at least Largo Caballero is content, just to sit there and let it all go to chaos so that he can take over. And Athania is increasingly kind of just defeatist and kind of giving up on the situation. So the summer of 36, the military coup is pretty much in place. On the 5th of July, a plane sets off to pick up Franco from the Canary Islands. It's actually sent from London, Croydon in South London, which is organised by a right-wing Spanish newspaper correspondent based in London, is tasked with organising transport to get Franco to Morocco. Because, of course, he couldn't just go on a military plane to Morocco because the government would be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
It would have to be above board. So they're kind of secretly getting him transport so he can go to Morocco to take command of the African Easter troops. Then, before that plan can fully kind of be put into place, on the 12th of July, a left-wing member of the police is assassinated. A guy called Jesus Castillo is, as I say, a police officer known to be a Republican supporter, and the Falange shoot him on his own street when he's leaving his house. Now, what happens is that night, the night of the 12th, 13th of July, his comrades, Jesus Castillo's comrades, basically decide we're going to take revenge. We're going to take revenge on the right for killing our friend.
Yeah.
They call on Gil Robles' house in Madrid, but he's on holiday. They then call on a monarchist, leading figure of the monarchist party, Calvo Sotelo, who incidentally had been finance minister under Primo. They knock on his door. They say, "Come with us, please." They kidnap him. They take him to a cemetery and they shoot him.
Right.
So you have a bunch of police officers, a bunch of Republican supporters carrying out a revenge attack.
Yeah.
Which is not... It just shows you kind of how far things have fallen. Now, although the army coup, as we've seen, was going to happen anyway, this provides the perfect excuse.
Yeah, this is the motive that they can use to kind of cover up their real motivations and say, well, look at the violence that the left is causing. We're going to step in.
Exactly, and that is exactly what the army's line is that we are coming in to restore law and order, to displace this government which has failed Spain and let it descend into chaos, and to save Spain from some sort of left-wing revolution that surely must be coming because of all this violence.
Yeah.
That's their perspective anyway. And so a few days later, on the 17th of July, army officers in Morocco stage a coup, and the following day, 18th of July, their coup moves into the Spanish mainland itself. And the Spanish Civil War begins. So that murder is kind of the trigger point that really helps them decide when to act.
Yeah.
They were going to act at some point, and I think a lot of historians would say the significance is that maybe waverers, maybe people who might have gone one way or the other, that would have persuaded them to join the coup. So yeah, most complicated war. Those causes, it's pretty complex.
Yeah, it's a complicated war, and they're complicated causes.
Once the war started, a lot of obviously foreign journalists and foreign fighters got involved in the Spanish Civil War, which we'll come to next time. And it was kind of portrayed abroad as pretty simple, just a left-wing government and a right-wing army coup to try and get rid of it.
Yeah.
But that is just scratching the very surface, as you can kind of see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what people kind of tend to look back on it as nowadays. They still do look... I mean, in terms of entry-level kind of stuff, people who aren't too well-versed on the Spanish Civil War, it is just thought of, a left versus right kind of thing. But there are so many moving parts to this, and there's so many elements which we are going to get into in the next episode.
Absolutely. Yes. So yeah.
I mean, this is such a weird time, and it's so deeply fascinating to me, and I hope our listeners find it fascinating as well.
It's so complex, and it's this issue of who's to blame. It's really complicated because there's definitely failings on left and right.
Yeah.
In this build-up that we've seen, and both sides have kind of been guilty of, when they're in power, of kind of abusing that to some extent. You might say that depending on your perspective, you might say, well, when Nathaniel was in power, at least he was trying to achieve noble aims. But the right at the time would have thought, in their own perspective, that restoring the power of the church and the army and the landowners was the right thing to do. But then, obviously, there's mistakes made by the Republicans, especially after they win the election of 36, not to take advantage of that. And there's kind of mistakes made by the right in the sense of taking those bribes to undermine their own government.
Yeah.
But it's a real tragedy, to be honest, from all sides.
Yeah. And it will get more tragic. It's going to get worse. And we are going to cover that in the next episode.
Our next episode. History's Most Complicated War, Part 2.
The war itself.
Yeah, the conflict.
I'm looking towards...
Because, of course, these complexities continue.
Oh, yeah. They do continue, and there's a lot of moving parts to this as well. Just in regards to the fronts moving, because they move pretty quickly.
There's military, there's political, there's all sorts of aspects.
All sorts of things
that we're going to get up to.
So yeah, looking forward to that. And like we said at the beginning of the episode, you've got a book out on the Spanish Civil War. I'll put a link down to that in the description of this episode.
On what we've talked about today, I do go over kind of a brief history of the time period and the Republic and the causes of the war, which obviously probably goes into a bit more detail than we've been able to in this discussion. So if it's something that interests you, you may well find out kind of more juicy information there.
Yeah. Like I said, I'll put a description or a link down in the description of this episode. So if you want to check that out, you can find that down there. Well, it's been a very, very enlightening experience today. Very good to talk to you. Mm-hmm. And join us next time for History's Most Complicated War, Part 2.
And find out the kind of conclusion to the story of our Spain series.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for listening. I've been Peter.
And I've been Alex. Have a great day.